The low amber light of the onyx bar was supposed to be sophisticated, but tonight, it just felt predatory. Paige Blake's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the cool, smooth jazz filtering through the speakers. Her friend's text message burned in her mind. He's here, with her. Don't do anything crazy. Too late for that. And then she saw them. Tucked into a plush velvet booth in the corner was her boyfriend of 3 years, Charles. And leaning into him, her laughter like tinkling, broken glass, was the woman from his office he had sworn was just a colleague. Her hand was on his thigh, and his was tangled in her hair. It wasn't a friendly chat. It was a final, brutal confirmation. A cold, sharp pain lanced through Paige's chest, so intense it made her gasp. For a moment, she was frozen, a statue of heartbreak and betrayal. Then, the pain curdled into a white-hot rage. She walked toward them, her movement stiff, her vision narrowing until they were the only 2 people in the room. "Charles," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. He looked up, and the charming smile on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic, then annoyance. "Paige, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she said, her gaze flicking to the woman beside him, who now looked distinctly uncomfortable. Charles sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He looked bored. "Look, Paige, let's not make a scene." "A scene?" she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You're cheating on me in public, in a bar where half our professional circle hangs out, and you're worried about me making a scene?" He stood up then, his expression hardening into something cruel. "All right, you want the truth?" he said, his voice low and dismissive. "What did you expect? I need someone who's on my level, someone exciting. You're comfortable, Paige. You're predictable. She," he gestured to the woman, "is a challenge." The public humiliation was a physical blow. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had belittled her, dismissed her, made her feel small and worthless in front of their peers. Tears of fury and shame burned her eyes. She looked at his smug, arrogant face, and a reckless, desperate idea exploded in her mind. She wasn't going to leave in tears. She was going to leave a scar on his massive ego. Her eyes scanned the bar and landed on a man sitting alone at the counter. He was tall, dark, and impossibly handsome, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her car. He exuded a quiet, intimidating power, a stillness that commanded attention more than any loud voice ever could. He was, without a doubt, the most formidable man in the room. Perfect. In a move fueled by pure, unadulterated impulse, Paige turned her back on Charles. She marched straight to the stranger, who looked up, a flicker of surprise in his cool, gray eyes as she approached. She didn't say a word. She reached out, grabbed the lapel of his expensive suit, pulled him forward and kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a furious, passionate, all-consuming kiss. It was a kiss that poured out 3 years of love and a single night of heartbreak. For a split second, the stranger was still, shocked by her audacity. Then, to her surprise, she felt his hand come up to the small of her back, pulling her closer, responding to the kiss with a controlled, possessive pressure that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She finally pulled away, breathless, her lips tingling. She didn't look at the stranger. She turned and fixed her gaze on Charles, whose jaw was hanging open in stunned disbelief. "Turns out, Charles," she said, her voice clear and ringing with a triumphant fire, "I was looking for something more exciting, too." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked out of the bar, her head held high. She left behind her shocked ex-boyfriend, a room full of stunned onlookers, and a mysterious, intrigued stranger at the bar, without ever having exchanged a single word with him. Monday morning at Innovate Design Studio was a frantic, caffeine-fueled haze. Paige threw herself into her work, using complex design grids and color palettes as a shield against the emotional hangover from the weekend. She had successfully avoided Charles's barrage of angry texts and voicemails, but the memory of her own reckless act, kissing a complete stranger, made her cheeks burn every time she thought of it. It had been a moment of insane, satisfying madness, but now, in the harsh light of day, it just felt insane. Around 10 a.m., a palpable buzz swept through the office. An email, marked with the highest level of urgency, had landed in every employee's inbox. Subject: Emergency all-hands meeting. Do not miss. The body of the email was brief and world-shattering. Innovate Design Studio had been acquired. Effective immediately, they were now a subsidiary of the global media behemoth, Harrington Media. A town hall meeting was scheduled for 11 a.m. to introduce the new CEO. The conference room was packed, the air thick with nervous energy and whispered speculation. Paige stood in the middle of the crowd with her colleagues, making anxious jokes to mask her own rising panic. "Well, there goes our creative freedom," her deskmate Leo muttered. "I hear the Harrington Media guys are corporate sharks." "I just hope the new overlord appreciates our work," Paige whispered back, "and keeps us employed." At precisely 11 a.m., the company's director of HR, a nervous-looking man named Mr. Henderson, walked onto the small stage at the front of the room. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "As you know, this is a day of significant transition for Innovate.
It is my great honor to introduce the visionary leader who will be guiding us into this new and exciting future. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our new CEO, Mr. Christopher Harrington." A man walked onto the stage from the wings, and Paige's world stopped. It was him. The stranger from the bar. He was even more formidable on stage, his presence commanding the entire room. He wore the same quiet power like a custom-tailored suit.
His cool, grey eyes swept across the crowd, analytical and assessing. Then, they found her. His gaze locked onto hers from across the room. There was no visible change in his stony expression, but she saw it. A flicker of something in his eyes. A spark of recognition, a flash of surprise, and something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like amusement. He knew. Her heart, which had stopped moments before, now began to hammer against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. She felt the blood drain from her face. He delivered a speech about synergy, efficiency, and a new era of innovation. It was a standard, bloodless corporate speech, but coming from him, every word felt like a personal threat. After the speech, as the stunned employees began to disperse, Christopher Harrington descended from the stage. He moved through the crowd like a shark parting a school of fish, his presence silencing conversations as he passed. Paige tried to shrink, to blend into the background, praying he would just walk past. He didn't. He stopped directly in front of her. Her colleagues instinctively took a step back, leaving her isolated, standing before him. "Miss Blake, isn't it?" he said, his voice calm and low, yet it carried an authority that made the hairs on her arms stand up. His eyes, however, were anything but calm. They were glinting with a dangerous, knowing light. "I was reviewing your employee file this morning. Promising talent." He extended his hand. It was not a friendly gesture. It was a command. Numbly, she placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, his skin warm, and the brief contact sent a jolt of memory, of the bar, of his hand on her back, through her. "I'd like to see you in my new office in 5 minutes," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "We have a great deal to discuss about your future with this company." "Hey dear, before we continue, don't forget to hit subscribe and help us grow. Thank you for being here. Let's keep going." The 5-minute walk to the CEO's office felt like a mile-long journey to the gallows. Paige's legs were trembling, her mind a chaotic whirlwind of panic and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. It was a cosmic joke of the cruelest kind. She knocked on the heavy oak door, her knuckles barely making a sound. "Enter!" A calm, controlled voice commanded. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office, once the familiar, slightly cluttered space of her old boss, had been transformed. It was now a minimalist fortress of glass and steel, dominated by a massive desk and a panoramic view of the city. Christopher Harrington stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at his new domain. "Close the door," he said, without turning around. She did as she was told, the soft click of the latch echoing in the silent, cavernous room. He turned slowly, a predator savoring the moment. His face was a mask of cool indifference, but his eyes were dancing with a dark, mocking amusement. "What a performance, Miss Blake," he began, his voice a low, smooth purr. "I must admit, it was the most memorable introduction I've ever had to a new employee." He began to walk slowly toward her, circling her as if she were a piece of art he was considering acquiring. The audacity, the passion, the sheer, reckless impulsiveness of it all, truly remarkable. "Mr. Harrington," she began, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I am so sorry. I had no idea who you were. It was a mistake, a terrible, unprofessional—" "A mistake?" he interrupted, stopping directly in front of her. "Oh, I don't think so. It was a calculated move, a desperate, emotional but calculated move to wound an adversary, and it was very, very effective." He was so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, the same scent from the bar. "The problem, Paige," he said, his voice dropping, using her first name for the first time, a deliberate act of intimacy that felt like a threat, "is that your passion and your recklessness are now my assets, and I cannot have my assets behaving in such an unpredictable manner." She braced herself, expecting the inevitable. "I understand. I'll clear out my desk." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Fire you? Oh no, that would be far too simple. Firing you would mean I don't get to enjoy the delightful irony of this situation, and I do so love irony." He moved back to his desk, a new, dangerous glint in his eye. "No, you're not fired, but your previous position on the junior design team no longer exists." A cold dread washed over her. "What?" "From this moment on, you are my personal design liaison," he announced, the title sounding both like a promotion and a prison sentence. "You will report directly and only to me. You will work on all my priority projects. You will be at my beck and call. Your desk will be moved to the anteroom just outside this office." He had her. He had isolated her from her team, from her colleagues, from any semblance of her old work life. He had placed her directly under his thumb, in a position where she would have to see him, interact with him, every single day. "Consider this a unique opportunity, Paige," he said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "An opportunity to prove that your passion is not limited to dramatic displays in bars. You want it to be exciting. Well, your life is about to get very exciting indeed." She stood there, frozen, realizing the full extent of her nightmare. She hadn't just kissed a stranger. She had kissed her new boss, her new tormentor, the man who now held her entire future in the palm of his hand. Her one-night act of revenge had just turned into a long-term sentence. The next morning, Paige's world had been completely upended. Her desk, once nestled in the noisy, collaborative chaos of the design department, was now located in the silent, sterile anteroom outside Christopher's office. It was a beautiful, lonely island. Her former colleagues would walk past, offering her small, pitying smiles or avoiding her gaze altogether. She was no longer one of them. She was now the CEO's personal design liaison, a title that dripped with suspicion and gossip. Christopher wasted no time in assigning her first project. He called her into his office, the glint of challenge in his eyes. "Your first task is to redesign the corporate logo for Harrington Media itself," he announced, his tone deceptively casual. Paige's blood ran cold. The Harrington Media logo was an institution, a globally recognized symbol of power and influence. Redesigning it was a monumental task, a career-making or career-breaking project of the highest possible stakes. Our current logo is stale, he continued, leaning back in his chair. It lacks vision. It needs new life. It needs passion. He let the word hang in the air, a deliberate, pointed reference to their first meeting. I want to see your preliminary concepts by the end of the week. It was an impossible deadline. A project of this magnitude should take months of research and development, not 4 days. She knew immediately what this was, a test, a trial by fire designed to make her fail. For the next 4 days, Paige barely slept. She threw herself into the work with a fierce, desperate energy. She filled sketchbooks with ideas, spent hours researching corporate branding theory, and drank enough coffee to fuel a small army. She was determined not to give him the satisfaction of watching her crumble. She worked late each night, often the last person in the building besides Christopher himself, who seemed to live in his office. The dynamic between them was a tense, silent war. He would walk past her desk without a word, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching, assessing. On the final night before the deadline, she was in his office, pinning her final 3 concepts to a large presentation board. It was well past midnight. "You're still here," he said, his voice startling her. He had been standing in the doorway watching her. "The deadline is tomorrow," she replied, not looking at him, her voice tight with exhaustion and stress. He walked over to the board, studying her designs. They were brilliant. One was a bold, evolutionary take on the current logo. The second was a complete revolutionary departure. The third was a clever, minimalist design that was both modern and timeless. He was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. "This one," he said finally, pointing to the third, minimalist concept. "It's clean, powerful, intelligent, but the font choice is weak. It lacks authority." "I disagree," she shot back, her exhaustion making her bold. "The sans serif font is modern and approachable. It's meant to signal a shift toward a more transparent, forward-thinking company. An authoritative serif font would be a step backward. It's predictable." He turned to face her, a flicker of anger in his eyes. "Are you calling my judgment predictable, Miss Blake?" "I'm calling your suggestion safe," she retorted, her own frustration boiling over. "You talk about wanting new life and passion, but when you see it, you want to control it, to force it into a box you already understand. You're a micromanager, Mr. Harrington." The words hung in the air, a shocking act of insubordination. He took a step closer, his towering presence filling her space. They were inches apart, the adrenaline of their argument a palpable current between them. His eyes, dark and intense, dropped to her lips. The memory of the kiss, the raw, electric moment in the bar, flashed between them, as real and as present as the tension in the room. He leaned in, his breath warm on her cheek. For a heart-stopping second, she thought he was going to kiss her again. But then, he abruptly pulled back, his expression once again a mask of cool control. "The deadline is 9 a.m., Miss Blake," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Don't disappoint me." He turned and walked out of the office, leaving her standing there, her heart hammering, her body trembling with a confusing, infuriating mix of anger, adrenaline, and undeniable attraction. Paige's minimalist logo design, after a tense final review, was chosen. Christopher, true to his nature, took full credit for guiding the project to success, but the whispers in the industry's design circles knew the truth. The brilliant, clean concept had come from Paige Blake. Her name, once unknown, was suddenly on the map. It was a small victory, but it was hers. The victory, however, came with a bitter consequence. Charles, her ex, heard the news. He discovered that not only had Paige not been fired, but she was now working directly under the new billionaire CEO, the very man she had kissed in the bar. Consumed by a toxic cocktail of jealousy and a wounded ego, he did something petty and destructive. One afternoon, he showed up in the gleaming marble lobby of Harrington Media headquarters. "I'm here to see Paige Blake," he announced to the receptionist, his voice loud and belligerent. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" the receptionist asked politely. "No, I don't have an appointment," Charles sneered. "But I'm sure she'll see me. We have some unfinished business." He leaned in conspiratorially. "You know, it's amazing how fast some people climb the corporate ladder once they start sleeping with the boss." The receptionist's eyes widened in shock. The comment was loud enough for several people in the lobby to hear. It was a deliberate public attempt to humiliate Paige and sabotage her newfound professional standing. The receptionist, following protocol, discreetly alerted security, and then, knowing the sensitivity of the situation, called Christopher's office directly. Paige, hearing the commotion from her desk in the anteroom, felt a cold dread wash over her. She recognized that voice. She walked to the glass doors of the office suite and looked down into the lobby. She saw Charles, making a scene. Her heart sank. Before she could react, Christopher emerged from his office, his face a mask of thunderous rage. He had clearly been listening on the intercom. "Stay here," he commanded her, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He didn't take the elevator. He descended the grand, sweeping staircase that connected the executive floor to the lobby, his movements controlled, deliberate, and utterly menacing. Every eye in the lobby was on him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He stopped directly in front of Charles, his presence so powerful it seemed to suck the air out of the room. "You must be Mr. Davies," Christopher said, his voice a blade of ice. "Charles," he corrected, trying to sound confident, but failing miserably. "I don't care what your name is," Christopher continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Miss Blake is currently occupied doing the brilliant, innovative work that her talent warrants. Work that is integral to the future of my company. You, on the other hand, are trespassing on private property and harassing one of my most valued employees." He took a step closer, and Charles instinctively flinched back. "This is the only time I will say this. Security will escort you out. If you ever set foot in this building again, if you ever contact Miss Blake again, if I even hear you speak her name in a public forum again, the full weight of the Harrington Media Legal Department will descend upon you. We will dismantle your career, your reputation, and your financial stability with such surgical precision that you will spend the rest of your life wishing you had never heard the name Paige Blake. Am I clear?" Charles, pale and trembling, could only nod. "Good," Christopher said, turning his back on him as security guards moved in. He looked up and his eyes met Paige's, who had been watching the entire scene, frozen, from the top of the stairs. The cold, lethal fury in his expression softened for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of something else. Concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. She could only nod, her throat tight with a confusing mix of emotions. He hadn't used the situation to mock her or to remind her of her recklessness. He hadn't put the blame on her. He had defended her, fiercely, publicly. He had protected her reputation and her honor with the cold, brutal efficiency of a king defending his most prized possession. And it was the most confusing and thrilling thing she had ever witnessed. In the aftermath of the lobby incident, a new, unspoken understanding settled between them. Christopher's public defense of her had been a turning point. He had treated her not as a subordinate to be controlled, but as a valued asset to be protected. The gossip in the office quieted down, replaced by a grudging respect. Paige, in turn, found it harder and harder to maintain her professional animosity toward him. He was still her demanding, infuriatingly controlling boss, but he was also the man who had shielded her without hesitation. Their fragile new dynamic was put to the test 2 weeks later. "Pack a bag," Christopher announced, walking into her anteroom without breaking stride. "We're going to Milan. There's a design exposition. We leave in 3 hours." The trip was a whirlwind. Milan was a city of art, fashion, and undeniable romance, a dangerous backdrop for their already complicated relationship. During the day, they were all business. They moved through the exposition with a professional synergy that surprised them both, debating design philosophies, critiquing new trends, and gathering ideas for Harrington Media's next big project. They were a formidable team, their minds seeming to work in perfect complementary sync. But at night, the professional lines blurred. Under the guise of market research and client dinners, they explored the city. They shared a plate of pasta in a tiny family-owned trattoria, arguing playfully about which artist had more influence on modern design. They walked through the historic Brera district, the warm evening air filled with the sound of music and laughter. For moments at a time, she would forget he was her boss, the man who held her career in his hands. He was just Christopher, a man with a surprisingly sharp wit and a hidden passion for architecture. The breaking point came on their last night. After a long, successful day, they returned to their hotel suite, a magnificent space with a shared living area and a large balcony overlooking the spires of the Duomo. "A successful trip, I think," Christopher said, loosening his tie as he poured them both a glass of wine. "Very successful," Paige agreed, taking the glass he offered. They stood on the balcony, the setting sun casting a golden, ethereal glow over the city. The atmosphere was charged, intimate. "Paige," he said softly, his voice losing its usual commanding edge. He turned to face her, leaning against the railing. "I have to ask. That night at the bar, why me?" It was the first time he had directly addressed the kiss since she had started working for him. The question was quiet, genuine, stripped of all mockery. She looked out at the magnificent cathedral, its spires reaching for the heavens. "I was hurt," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, "and angry. I wanted to hurt him back, and you." She paused, then finally looked at him. "You looked like the most powerful man in the room. You looked strong, untouchable." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze intense. He moved closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the heat from his body. "And what if I kissed you now, Paige?" he murmured, his voice a low, husky caress. "With no revenge, no games, no audience." Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment she had been simultaneously dreading and craving. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. His eyes searched hers, full of a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. He leaned in, his lips just inches from hers. She closed her eyes, her body swaying toward him in surrender. And then he stopped. He let out a sharp, frustrated breath and pulled back, dropping his hand as if he'd been burned. He turned away from her, gripping the balcony railing, his knuckles white. "We have an early flight," he said, his voice strained, harsh. "You should get some sleep." He didn't look at her again. He walked back into the suite and disappeared into his room, leaving her alone on the balcony, her body trembling, her lips aching with the ghost of a kiss that had been promised, and then cruelly, inexplicably, denied. The flight back from Milan was a silent, agonizing torture. The space between them crackled with the unspoken question left hanging on the balcony. Why had he pulled back? The almost kiss was a ghost that haunted Paige, a constant, frustrating reminder of the impassable wall that still stood between them. Back in the office, Christopher was more distant and demanding than ever. He threw himself back into his work with a vengeance, his interactions with Paige becoming clipped, formal, and strictly professional. It was as if he was trying to erase the intimacy of Milan, to rebuild the wall he himself had almost torn down. Paige, hurt and confused, retreated into her own shell, focusing on her work and trying to ignore the ache in her heart. A few weeks later, while organizing his chaotic digital calendar, a task he had pointedly assigned her, she saw it. It was a recurring monthly appointment, blocked out for 3 hours every third Thursday. Unlike his other meetings, which were meticulously labeled Board Meeting, Acquisition Call, Tokyo, this one was marked with a single cryptic word, Clinic. A jolt of unease went through her. Was he sick? The thought was a cold, sharp jab of fear she wasn't prepared for. But he was the picture of health, a man in his prime. Maybe it was a routine checkup, but 3 hours every month? It didn't add up. Her curiosity, now piqued, became a low-grade obsession. It was a puzzle, and she was a natural problem solver. During a quiet afternoon when he was locked in a board meeting, she did something she knew she shouldn't. She opened a private browser window and typed the name of the clinic from his calendar into the search bar. The results surprised her. The Westwood Clinic wasn't a hospital or a private doctor's office. It was a high-end, exclusive palliative care facility. A hospice. Her heart began to pound. Why would a man like Christopher Harrington have a recurring appointment at a hospice? Driven by a need she didn't fully understand, she dug deeper. She used the research skills she had honed as a designer to cross-reference public records, charity databases, and old society articles. It took her 2 hours, but she finally found it. An old article from a philanthropic journal detailing the major anonymous donors to the Westwood Clinic. The article mentioned that the clinic's primary benefactor, who had funded the construction of an entire new wing, had done so in memory of his mother, Eleanor Harrington, who had passed away there 5 years prior after a long, painful battle with a degenerative neurological disease. The pieces clicked into place with a devastating clarity. The coldness, the obsession with control, the demanding perfectionism, the way he had looked at her with such raw concern when she was sick, the way he had pulled back from the kiss in Milan, as if terrified of getting too close. It wasn't arrogance, it was armor. He wasn't a man who was afraid of being hurt in a business deal. He was a man who had watched, helplessly, as the person he loved most was slowly, cruelly taken from him by something he couldn't fight, couldn't control, and couldn't fix. His entire life, his entire empire, was a fortress built around the memory of that powerlessness. His obsession with controlling every aspect of his professional life was a desperate attempt to master a world that had once proven to him, in the most brutal way possible, that some things are utterly, heartbreakingly uncontrollable. She leaned back in her chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating her face. The anger and frustration she had felt toward him, the resentment for his games and his control, it all evaporated, replaced by a wave of profound, aching compassion. She wasn't just a pawn in his game. She was a variable he couldn't predict, an emotion he was terrified of feeling again. He hadn't pulled back from the kiss in Milan to punish her. He had pulled back to protect himself. She looked at the closed door of his office, and for the first time, she didn't see a tyrant or a billionaire boss. She saw a man who was still grieving, a man who was deeply, secretly, and utterly alone. The discovery changed the way Paige saw everything. Christopher's demanding nature was no longer a personal attack. It was a symptom of his fear. His emotional distance was not a sign of arrogance, but of a deep, unhealed wound. She found herself watching him with a new, painful empathy, seeing the lonely man behind the powerful CEO. A few weeks later, she noticed the date on her calendar. It was the 3rd Thursday of the month, the day of his clinic appointment. He was a storm in the office that morning, his mood darker and more volatile than she had ever seen it. He was sharp with his subordinates, dismissive in his meetings, and relentlessly critical of her work, finding fault with even the most minor details of a project she had spent weeks perfecting. "This is unacceptable, Paige," he snapped, tossing a design proof onto her desk. "The kerning is off by a fraction of a millimeter. Do it again." The old Paige would have bristled, would have fought back against the unfair criticism. But the new Paige understood. This wasn't about the design. This was about the day. This was about a pain he didn't know how to process. He dismissed everyone early that afternoon, his face a grim, unreadable mask. "I have an appointment," was all he said. Paige watched him leave, a powerful, protective instinct rising in her. She knew he was going to the clinic. She knew he was going to face the ghosts of his past, alone. And she couldn't let that happen. She stayed. Hours later, long after the sun had set and the office was a dark, silent tomb. She heard the private elevator chime. He walked into the office suite, looking utterly depleted. He had shed his suit jacket and tie, his shirt was untucked, and he looked smaller, more human than she had ever seen him. He didn't seem to notice her at first, walking straight to his office. She gave him a few minutes, then quietly followed. She found him standing in the dark, his back to the door, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at a small framed photograph on his credenza. It was a picture of a vibrant, smiling woman with his same gray eyes. His mother. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Christopher," she said softly from the doorway. He startled, spinning around, his face a mask of shock and anger. "What are you still doing here? I told everyone to go home." "I know," she said, walking slowly into the room. "But I didn't think you should be alone tonight." "I don't need a babysitter, Paige," he snarled, his voice rough with unshed grief. "I know you don't," she replied, her voice calm and gentle. She stopped a few feet from him. "But maybe you just need a friend." Her quiet, unwavering presence, her refusal to be pushed away seemed to disarm him. The anger drained out of him, leaving behind only a raw, bone-deep weariness. "Today is the anniversary," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The day she died." He finally looked at her, and his carefully constructed armor crumbled completely. She saw not the billionaire CEO, but a son who still missed his mother, a man drowning in a grief he had carried alone for 5 long years. She was everything, he choked out, the words a painful, ragged confession. "And I couldn't do anything. All my money, all my power, all my knowledge. And I just had to stand there and watch her fade away. I couldn't control it." In that moment, Paige understood everything. She closed the space between them. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply reached out and took the whiskey glass from his trembling hand, placing it on the desk. Then she took his hand in hers. His hand was cold, but his grip was surprisingly strong, clinging to hers as if it were a lifeline. It wasn't a romantic touch. It wasn't a gesture of power. It was a profoundly human connection, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain and understanding. He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The last wall between them had finally, completely crumbled. "Sweetheart, are you loving this story? Click subscribe now so you won't miss the next twist. Thanks for the support." The moment stretched, silent and sacred, in the dimly lit office. Christopher's hand clung to hers, a silent, desperate anchor in the storm of his grief. The carefully drawn lines between them, boss and employee, tormentor and victim, had been completely erased, leaving only a man and a woman, connected by a shared, profound vulnerability. The dynamic in the weeks that followed was entirely new. The tension was still there, but it was no longer a battle of wills. It was a quiet, humming awareness, a shared intimacy that lived just beneath the surface of their professional interactions. He was still her boss, still demanding and exacting, but the cold, critical edge was gone. In its place was a new respect, a new softness in his eyes when he looked at her. They fell into a new routine. They worked late, not because he was a tyrant, but because they had become a true team. The rebranding project for Harrington Media was nearing its final stages, and their creative synergy was undeniable. He would challenge her ideas, pushing her to be better, and she would defend her vision with a passion and intelligence that he had come to admire deeply. One night, they were the last two in the building, putting the final touches on the massive presentation for the board of directors. The new logo, her logo, was at the heart of it all. It was brilliant, and they both knew it. "It's done," she said, stepping back from the large screen, a wave of exhaustion and pride washing over her. "It's perfect," he replied, his voice quiet. He was standing closer than she had realized, He walked over to a small hidden bar in his office and opened a bottle of champagne. "This calls for a celebration," he said. He handed her a flute, the bubbles fizzing between them. "To the new Harrington media," he said, raising his glass. "And to its brilliant designer," he added, his eyes locking onto hers, a warm, genuine smile on his face. "We make a good team," she said, her voice a little breathless. "Yes," he agreed, his voice dropping, becoming a low, intimate murmur. "We do." He set his glass down and took hers, placing it beside his. He took a step closer, and the celebratory atmosphere evaporated, replaced by the familiar, heart-stopping electricity that always seemed to hum between them. "Paige," he said, his voice a raw, husky whisper. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. It was the same gesture he had made in Milan, but this time there was no hesitation, no fear, only a deep, undeniable certainty. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. She couldn't. She met him halfway, her eyes fluttering shut. And then he kissed her. This was the second kiss, and it was nothing like the first. The first had been a weapon, an act of fury and revenge. This was a surrender. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with all the unspoken words, all the pent-up emotion, all the quiet understanding that had grown between them over the past few months. It was a kiss that spoke of shared grief, of mutual respect, and of a deep, powerful attraction that would no longer be denied. It was a confession, a promise, a beginning. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. The truth of what they had become finally, irrevocably laid bare. The game was over, the battle was won, and in the silent, moonlit office, they had both, finally, surrendered. The morning after the second kiss was like waking up in a new world, one where all the colors were brighter, more intense. When Paige walked into the office, the air itself felt different. She tried to act normal, to focus on her work, but every time she looked at the door to Christopher's office, her heart did a little flip. He called her in around mid-morning to review the presentation. The pretense of professionalism was a thin, fragile veneer over the new reality between them. He would stand too close, his hand brushing hers as they looked at the screen. She would catch him looking at her, a soft, private smile on his lips. The tension that had once been a battle was now a thrilling, secret current that flowed only between them. But secrets, in a corporate environment, have a short lifespan. It didn't take long for the office to notice. The change in their CEO was too dramatic to ignore. The cold, intimidating Mr. Harrington was gone, replaced by a man who smiled, who seemed more relaxed, more human. And the only person who seemed to be the recipient of this new warmth was his personal design liaison. The whispers started almost immediately. They were quiet at first, speculative, but they soon grew louder, uglier, fueled by the jealousy of those who had been passed over. Paige's former department head, a man named Mark, who had always been resentful of her direct line to the CEO, was the primary instigator. "It's obvious what's going on," he would mutter to his team by the coffee machine. "She slept her way to the top. That logo design? I bet he gave her the idea." The rumors spread like a virus, poisoning the atmosphere. Paige's hard-won success was being rewritten as a sordid office affair. Her talent was being dismissed, her brilliant work attributed not to her mind, but to her supposed relationship with the boss. Colleagues who had once been friendly now gave her cold, judgmental stares. Her lunch invitations dried up. She was isolated again, but this time it was worse. Before, they had pitied her. Now, they scorned her. The final blow came after the board presentation. The rebranding was a monumental success. The board was ecstatic, praising the new, modern direction. Christopher, in his speech, gave Paige full and public credit for the design. The vision and brilliance behind this new logo, belong entirely to Miss Blake, he had announced. But his praise backfired. In the eyes of her colleagues, it wasn't a validation of her talent. It was a confirmation of her special status. Later that day, she overheard Mark talking to a group in the hallway. Of course he gave her credit, he sneered. He has to keep his little pet happy. The crude, dismissive comment was a physical blow. It invalidated every late night, every ounce of creative energy, every bit of her hard work. She realized with a sickening certainty that as long as she was in this building, under his authority, she would never be seen as anything more than the boss's girlfriend. Her professional reputation, the one thing she had fought so hard to build, was being destroyed by the very relationship that was bringing her so much personal joy. She loved Christopher, but she also loved her work, her independence, her pride, and she was being forced to choose between them. The weight of the office rumors, of the stolen credit and the dismissive whispers settled on Paige like a shroud. The joy she felt with Christopher was constantly being tainted by the poison of the workplace. She couldn't walk down the hall without feeling the sting of judgmental eyes. Her brilliant work, the source of her professional pride, was now the source of her greatest humiliation. She knew what she had to do. It was a heartbreaking, terrifying decision, but it was the only one she could make. That evening, she walked into Christopher's office. He was on the phone, but he smiled when he saw her, a warm, private smile that now made her heart ache. He quickly finished his call. "Perfect timing," he said, standing up. "I was just about to order dinner for us. I was thinking that new Italian place." "Christopher, we need to talk," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The smile on his face faded, replaced by a look of concern. He saw the pain in her eyes. "What is it? What's wrong?" She took a deep breath and placed a white envelope on his desk. "This is my letter of resignation," she said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. He stared at the envelope, then back at her, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "What? Why? Is this about us? I told you. I don't care what people think." "But I do," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I can't be the boss's girlfriend, Christopher. I can't have every success, every achievement attributed to you. I worked too hard to get here. My talent, my work. It has to be my own. It's the one thing I have that is truly mine." He rushed around the desk to her, his hands coming up to grip her arms gently. "Then I'll protect you," he said, his voice desperate. "I'll fire them. I'll fire Mark. I'll fire anyone who disrespects you. I'll make it clear that you earned your position." "No," she said, shaking her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Don't you see? That just makes it worse. It proves their point. It makes me the woman who gets people fired because she's sleeping with the boss. You can't protect me from this, Christopher. Your power is the problem." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He, a man who could solve any problem with his power and his money, was powerless to solve this. His very position was the weapon being used against her. "If what we have is real," she continued, her voice breaking, "if it's strong enough, it has to be able to exist outside of these walls, outside of your shadow. I can't be your employee and your partner at the same time. I have to choose. And I choose me. I choose my self-respect." He stared at her, his face etched with a pain and a desperation she had never seen before. He was losing her, and he knew it. He had finally let someone in, only to have the world he had built tear them apart. "So this is it?" he asked, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "You're just leaving?" "I have to," she sobbed, pulling away from his grasp. She left the letter of resignation on his desk, a white flag of surrender in a battle she couldn't win. She turned and walked out of his office, out of the building, out of the life she had just begun to build with him. She was choosing to lose him in the desperate, heartbreaking hope that it was the only way they could ever truly be together. The day after Paige resigned was the longest day of Christopher's life. Her empty desk outside his office was a constant gaping wound. The silence was deafening. He had spent the night staring at her letter of resignation, her words echoing in his mind. "Your power is the problem." She was right. He had built an empire on control, and that very control was now the thing that was costing him the only person who had ever managed to break through it. He had two choices. He could let her go, accepting that his world was too toxic for a love as real as theirs, or he could change the world. The next morning, he made his decision. At 10 a.m., another emergency all-hands meeting was called. The entire company gathered in the conference room, the air buzzing with speculation. Had the CEO's jilted lover finally been fired? Christopher walked onto the stage, but he was not the same man who had addressed them weeks ago. The cold, intimidating armor was gone. He looked tired, human, and resolute. "Good morning," he began, his voice quiet but firm, commanding the room's attention. "I've called you all here today to address the recent departure of Paige Blake." A murmur went through the crowd. "There have been rumors and speculation regarding Miss Blake's role in this company and her relationship with me," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, seeming to land on every person who had ever whispered a malicious word. "Let me be perfectly clear. Paige Blake is the most talented, innovative, and dedicated designer I have ever had the privilege of working with. The success of the Harrington Media rebranding is hers and hers alone. Her vision has set the course for the future of this company." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He saw Mark, her old boss, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the crowd. "Miss Blake resigned," Christopher said, his voice turning hard, "because the culture in this office, a culture that I, as CEO, am responsible for, made her feel that her success was not her own. It made her feel that her talent was being overshadowed by her personal life. And that is a failure of leadership." "My failure." The room was dead silent. No one had ever heard a CEO, especially not the formidable Christopher Harrington, admit to failure. "Effective immediately," he announced, his eyes finding Mark in the crowd. "Markham Reynolds will be transferred. He will be heading up our new satellite office in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm sure his leadership will be appreciated there." A collective gasp went through the room. It was a public execution. "This is a message to all of you," Christopher said, his voice a blade of ice. "This company will be a meritocracy. We will not tolerate gossip, harassment, or the undermining of talent. From now on, your work is the only thing that will speak for you." He took a deep breath, his expression softening as he came to the hardest part. "As for me," he said, his voice suddenly vulnerable, "I have realized that my own leadership requires a new perspective. Therefore, I will be taking a 1-month leave of absence, effective immediately." The shock in the room was palpable. "I am taking this time," he concluded, his voice now quiet, personal, directed not at the crowd, but at an audience of one, wherever she was, "to try and win back the love and respect of the most brilliant woman I have ever known. Thank you." He dropped the microphone onto the podium with a thud that echoed in the stunned silence. He turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind his company, his reputation, and his entire world of control. He had made his choice. He was choosing her. Paige saw the speech. A friend from the office had sent her a link to a video someone had secretly recorded. She watched it on her laptop in her small, quiet apartment, her hands pressed to her mouth in disbelief. She watched it once, then twice, then a third time, the tears streaming down her face. He had done it. He had dismantled his own image, admitted his failure, and punished the people who had wronged her, all in front of the entire company. He hadn't just defended her. He had validated her, publicly and unequivocally. And then he had given up his power, his control, all for the chance to win her back. 2 days later, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find him standing there. He wasn't the CEO of Harrington Media. He was just Christopher. He was dressed in a simple pair of jeans and a gray sweater, looking nervous and more handsome than she had ever seen him. He wasn't holding flowers or a gift. His hands were empty. "A 1-month leave of absence," he said, his voice quiet, a hopeful, tentative smile on his face. "No emails, no board meetings, no conference calls. Just me." He took a small, hesitant step forward. "Is it enough time to prove to you that I'm not just your boss?" She didn't answer with words. She stepped aside and opened the door wider, inviting him in. The month that followed was a revelation. They didn't go to fancy restaurants or exclusive parties. They went to museums. They took long walks in the park. They cooked dinner together in her tiny kitchen, bumping elbows and laughing as they argued over how much garlic was too much garlic. He met her family, not as a billionaire benefactor, but as the man who was in love with their daughter. He was charming, respectful, and surprisingly down to earth. She learned about the boy who had lost his mother too young, the boy who had built a fortress of control to keep the world at bay. He learned about the girl who had dreamed of being an artist, who had put her own ambitions on hold to support her family. They talked for hours, peeling back the layers of their public personas and revealing the real, vulnerable people underneath. They fell in love all over again. But this time, it wasn't a chaotic, confusing collision of power and attraction. It was a quiet, steady, and deeply intentional coming together of two equals. On the last day of his leave, they were sitting on a bench in the same park where they had had one of their first dates. "My month is up," he said softly, taking her hand. "I go back to being the CEO tomorrow." A flicker of the old fear went through her. "What does that mean for us?" He turned to her, his expression serious, his gray eyes full of a love so profound it took her breath away. "It means I go back to my job, but it doesn't change who I am. Not anymore." "You changed me, Paige." He squeezed her hand. "I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you, whether I'm in a boardroom or in your tiny kitchen." It was her turn to make a choice. She could let the fear win, or she could trust the man he had become. She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, sweet kiss, filled with all the hope and promise of their new beginning. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "That's enough." Christopher's return to Harrington Media was the subject of intense speculation, but the reality was far quieter and more profound than anyone expected. He and Paige walked into the building on that Monday morning hand in hand, a silent, united front. The message was clear and undeniable. They were a couple, partners, and they were not hiding. The atmosphere in the office had transformed. The public shaming of Mark and Christopher's own vulnerability had sent a shockwave through the corporate culture. The gossip had ceased, replaced by a quiet, watchful respect. Christopher's first order of business was to call Paige into his office. "Welcome back," he said, a warm, genuine smile on his face. "I've had your old desk moved back to the design department. Your former position is waiting for you." Paige smiled, but shook her head. "Thank you, Christopher, but I can't take it." His face fell. "Paige, I thought we did," she interrupted gently. "But nothing has changed. I'd still be your employee. We'd be right back where we started. I told you, I can't work under your shadow." She placed a thick, professionally bound document on his desk. "So I have a counteroffer." He looked at the document. The title on the cover read, "Proposal for Blake Creative, an independent creative agency." He looked up at her, intrigued. "I'm not asking for my job back," she explained, her voice confident and clear. "I'm proposing a business partnership. I want to launch my own creative design agency, an independent subsidiary of Harrington Media. I'll be the CEO. I'll build my own team, manage my own clients, including Harrington Media, and run my own P&L. You won't be my boss. You'll be my primary investor and a partner on the board." He read through the proposal, his expression shifting from surprise to profound admiration. It was brilliant. The business plan was meticulous, The financial projections were ambitious but realistic, and the vision was clear. She wasn't asking for a handout. She was demanding a seat at the table, a kingdom of her own alongside his. He looked up from the proposal, a slow, proud smile spreading across his face. He had fallen in love with her talent, her fire, her refusal to be controlled. And now, she was using all of those qualities to forge her own path, to meet him as an equal. "You're not asking me to hire you," he said, the admiration clear in his voice. "You're asking me to invest in you." "I am," she confirmed, her chin held high. "I'm asking you to bet on me, not as your girlfriend, but as a businesswoman." He stood up and walked around the desk to her. He didn't look at her like a CEO assessing a proposal. He looked at her like a man who was utterly in awe of the woman standing before him. "It's the smartest investment I'll ever make," he said. He extended his hand. "Congratulations, Madam CEO." She took his hand, a brilliant, triumphant smile on her face. They shook on it, not as boss and employee, but as partners. Then, he pulled her into his arms and sealed their new business deal with a kiss, a celebration of the new, equal partnership they had just forged, in business and in life. 1 year later, the offices of Blake Creative were a vibrant, chaotic hub of innovation. The space, which occupied an entire floor of the Harrington Media Tower, was the complete opposite of Christopher's minimalist fortress. It was filled with color, music, and the loud, passionate arguments of talented designers. And at its center was Paige. She stood at the head of a large conference table, leading her team through a final presentation for a major new client. She was no longer the timid girl in the corner. She was a leader, confident, respected, and brilliant in her own right. Her agency had become a resounding success, one of the most profitable and critically acclaimed subsidiaries under the Harrington Media umbrella. Christopher walked in quietly at the end of the meeting, not as the overarching CEO, but as a proud, supportive partner. He leaned against the doorframe, a soft smile on his face as he watched her command the room. The respect and admiration between them were a quiet, powerful current that everyone in the room could feel. Later that evening, they stood in her office, which had a view that rivaled his own. On a shelf behind her desk was a sleek, modern trophy, a prestigious National Design Award that Blake Creative had just won for their Harrington Media rebranding campaign. "Who would have thought," she mused, tracing the cool metal of the award with her finger, "that a desperate, vengeful kiss in a bar would lead to all of this?" He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "I would," he whispered in her ear. "It was the best investment I ever made." She laughed, leaning back against his chest. "I thought I was just a promising talent you were taking a risk on." "You were never a risk, Paige," he said, his voice a low, serious murmur. "You were a sure thing. I just had to be smart enough to get out of your way." She turned in his arms to face him, her eyes shining with a love that was now steady, deep, and sure. "I'm glad you did." "Me too," he said before leaning in to kiss her. They were not just a couple in love. They were a power couple, an empire of two, built not on a contract of convenience, but on a foundation of mutual respect, shared ambition, and a love that had rewritten all the rules. Our story ends here, sweetheart, but many more are waiting for you. Subscribe. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this one, and we'll meet again very soon. Thank you, and see you in the next story.